The crystal flute in David's hand didn't shatter, but the illusion of his 10-year marriage did, fractured by a single sentence drifting over the ambient jazz of the cocktail party. It wasn't just that his wife Elena was leaning too close to the man with the charcoal scarf. It was the way she laughed, a sound of unburdened intimacy, and whispered, "Honestly, Julian is my soulmate," before catching David's eye and mouthing, "It's just a joke." But as the city lights blurred past the window of their silent car ride home, David realized the punchline hadn't landed yet, and he was the only one not laughing. If the quiet dissection of a marriage and the cold architecture of revenge intrigue you, stay with me. The story is just beginning, and the fallout is best watched from the inside. The wind off Lake Michigan was sharp enough to cut glass, but inside the Sterling Gallery, the air was warm, scented with expensive perfume and the faint metallic tang of champagne. David Thorne stood near a pillar of exposed brick, his posture relaxed, though his eyes were scanning the room with the precision he usually reserved for blueprints. He was waiting for his wife. Elena was across the room, a splash of crimson silk in a sea of charcoal suits and little black dresses. She was radiant, holding court in a circle of three, her head thrown back in laughter. The sound was bright, infectious, and it usually made David's chest ache with a quiet pride. That's her, he would think, the light in the room. But tonight, the light was shining on someone else. Standing next to her, leaning in just a fraction too close, was Julian Vane. Julian was everything David was not. An artist, disheveled in a curated way, wearing a scarf indoors, his hands animated as he spoke. He whispered something into Elena's ear, and she swatted his arm playfully, her fingers lingering on the fabric of his jacket, a second longer than social convention dictated. David took a sip of his scotch. It tasted like smoke and iodine. He began to navigate the crowd, moving silently through the gaps in conversation, intending to join them. He wasn't a jealous man. He prided himself on that. Jealousy was messy, unstructured. He trusted the foundation of their 10 years together. He was 5 feet away when the conversation drifted over the ambient noise. "You two are inseparable lately," a woman in the circle teased, gesturing between Elena and Julian. "Should David be worried?" David paused. He waited for the standard deflection, the polite correction. "He's just a client. We're working on the gala launch." Instead, Elena beamed, her eyes locking onto Julian's with a softness that made David's stomach drop. "Oh, please," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial purr. "David knows he's the husband, but Julian is my soulmate. We just vibrate on the same frequency." The group laughed. Julian smirked, preening under the praise, and clinked his glass against hers. "To destiny," Julian toasted. "To destiny," Elena echoed. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The words soulmate and husband hung in the air, separated by a chasm of implied meaning. Husband was the structure, the utility, the obligation. Soulmate was the magic. David stepped into the circle. The laughter died down instantly as they noticed him. Julian straightened up, his smirk faltering into a polite, tight-lipped smile. Elena didn't flinch. She turned to him, her cheeks flushed with wine and adoration, and looped her arm through his. "David, we were just talking about the installation," she lied, smoothly, effortlessly. "I heard," David said. His voice was level, calm, betraying nothing of the noise in his head. He looked at Julian, then at his wife. I heard the part about the soulmate. The woman who had asked the question looked down at her shoes. Julian coughed. Elena rolled her eyes, tightening her grip on his arm, her nails digging in slightly. Oh, stop it, David. Don't be so literal. She looked around at the group, soliciting their support. He's an architect, you know. Everything is black and white. It was just a joke. A joke, David repeated. Yes, a joke, she said, her tone hardening just enough to warn him not to make a scene. She leaned in, whispering near his ear, her breath smelling of expensive Chardonnay. Don't be insecure. It's not a good look on you. She pulled back and flashed a dazzling smile at the group. See? He gets it. He knows I love him. She patted his chest, patronizing and dismissive, before turning back to Julian. Now tell them about the sculpture in the foyer. David stood there, the ghost of her touch fading from his lapel. He watched the back of her neck, the way she leaned toward Julian, as if magnetized. Just a joke. He finished his scotch in one swallow. The ice clinked against the glass, a lonely, hollow sound. He realized then that buildings didn't collapse because of a single storm. They collapsed because of the hairline fractures that went ignored for years. I'll bring the car around, David said quietly. Elena didn't even turn around. She just waved a hand over her shoulder, already laughing at something Julian had said. David walked out into the biting Chicago night. He handed his ticket to the valet, his hands steady, his mind coldly clear. If it was just a joke, he decided, staring at the gray pavement, then he would make sure he was the one writing the punchline. The drive home was a study in acoustics. The interior of the Audi was hermetically sealed against the Chicago wind, leaving only the hum of the tires on asphalt and the rhythmic tapping of Elena's thumbs against her phone screen. She hadn't looked up since they left the valet stand. The blue light from the device illuminated her cheekbones, casting her face in a spectral, ghostly glow. David drove with both hands on the wheel, his knuckles white not from exertion, but from the restraint required to keep the car steady. He was building the conversation in his head, laying the foundation, calculating the load-bearing capacity of the words he needed to say. When they arrived at their penthouse in the Gold Coast, the silence followed them into the elevator and spilled out into the foyer. The apartment was a masterpiece of modern design, David's design. Floor-to-ceiling windows, Italian marble, minimalist lines. Tonight, however, it felt less like a home and more like a museum exhibit where they were merely the night watchmen. Elena kicked off her heels near the entryway console, the sharp clatter echoing too loudly. She headed straight for the kitchen, pouring a glass of water with an air of casual exhaustion. You were quiet in the car, she said, finally breaking the silence, though her tone suggested his silence was a minor annoyance rather than a symptom of a problem. David stood by the kitchen island, loosening his tie. I was thinking about the joke. Elena paused, the glass halfway to her lips. She let out a short, sharp sigh, the sound of a parent dealing with a petulant child. Oh God, David, are we really doing this? I told you everyone was drinking. Julian is dramatic. That's his brand. It wasn't Julian who said it, David corrected, his voice low and steady. You said it. You called him your soulmate. And when I walked up, you didn't pull away. You leaned in. Elena set the glass down on the marble counter with a force that threatened to crack the stem. She turned to face him, crossing her arms over the crimson silk of her dress. The defensive posture was immediate. You are being suffocating, she said, shaking her head. Do you know how embarrassing it is? To have to explain to my client that my husband is too insecure to handle a little banter. Banter involves wit, Elena. Intimacy involves exclusion. You excluded me to let him in. I have to let him in, she snapped, her voice rising. He's the creative director for the biggest account my firm has landed in 5 years. Artists like Julian need to feel understood. They need a connection. It's work, David. It's part of the job. Since when does the job require late-night texts and public declarations of destiny? Elena laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. You're sounding like a parody of a jealous husband. It's pathetic. Julian understands the pressure I'm under. He listens. You just want to fix things. You want to structure everything, categorize everything. Not everything is a blueprint, David. She pulled her phone from her clutch as it buzzed on the counter. Her eyes darted to the screen, and for a split second, her expression softened, a micro-expression of relief and affection that vanished the moment she looked back at David. Is that him? David asked. It's work, she lied. The lie was so lazy it felt like an insult. Show me. No, she said, snatching the phone up. I'm not going to dignify that with a response. I deserve privacy. I deserve to have friends, without you analyzing every sentence for hidden meaning. She walked past him toward the master bedroom, the silk of her dress brushing against his suit trousers. At the doorway, she stopped but didn't turn around. You know, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut deeper than her shouting. Maybe if you were a little more like him, a little more spontaneous, a little less rigid, I wouldn't need to joke about finding a soulmate elsewhere. The bedroom door clicked shut. David stood alone in the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed. The city lights flickered outside the panoramic window. He looked at the spot where she had stood, replaying the conversation. She had successfully shifted the axis of the argument. She hadn't denied the intimacy. She had justified it by weaponizing his character. He was the villain because he noticed. He was the problem because he cared. David walked to the window and looked down at the street, 50 stories below. The cars were just streaks of light, moving in predictable lanes. He realized then that arguing with Elena was like trying to hold back the tide with a sieve. She believed her own narrative. He took his phone out of his pocket. He didn't text her. He didn't go into the bedroom to beg for reassurance. Instead, he opened his calendar app. He scrolled past their upcoming anniversary dinner reservation. He looked at the weeks ahead. If she wanted him to be less rigid, he would stop being the structure that held her up. If she wanted spontaneity, he would give her the chaos of a life without a safety net. He turned off the kitchen lights, leaving the room in darkness. He didn't go to the bedroom. He walked into the guest room, closed the door, and locked it. It was the first lock he had ever turned against his wife. It wouldn't be the last. The silence in the apartment didn't just settle. It ossified. In the week following the gallery incident, David and Elena moved around each other like satellites on decaying orbits, occupying the same space but never colliding. The arguments didn't resume. David didn't bring up Julian's name, and Elena, mistaking his quietude for submission, relaxed back into her routine. She assumed the storm had passed. She didn't realize she was living in the eye of it. David sat in his corner office overlooking the Chicago River. His desk was expansive, covered in blueprints for a new commercial high-rise in the Loop. But for the first time in his career, the structural loads and tension points on the paper held no interest for him. His attention was focused on the tablet propped up against his monitor, displaying a different kind of data, the itemized log of their shared family cellular plan. It was a breach of privacy he had never considered before. David respected boundaries. He believed in trust as a load-bearing wall, but when the wall cracks, you have to check the foundation. He scrolled through the data. The sheer volume of communication between Elena's number and the number ending in 8892, Julian, was staggering. It started early in the morning, often before David's alarm went off. It continued in bursts throughout the workday. But the heaviest traffic was late at night. 11:42 p.m., 12:15 a.m., 1:03 a.m. David looked at the timestamps. 1:03 a.m. on Tuesday. He remembered Tuesday. Elena had claimed she was exhausted, turning away from him in bed, pulling the duvet tight around her shoulders. "I have a headache, David. Just let me sleep." According to the log, she had texted Julian 4 minutes after turning off the bedside lamp. David didn't hack her messages. He didn't need to read the specific words to understand the language being spoken. The pattern told him everything. He compared the timestamps to his own text thread with her. To David, "Did you pay the HOA fee? Pick up dry cleaning, running late. Dinner in fridge." To Julian, inferred context based on call duration and frequency. 30-minute call at 8 o'clock a.m. during her commute. 45 texts between 9 p.m. and midnight. The realization hit him with the cold precision of a wrecking ball. He wasn't her husband. He was her logistics manager. He was the one who ensured the bills were paid, the clothes were clean, and the apartment was warm. He provided the stable, boring infrastructure that allowed her to live. And she used that stability to recharge her batteries so she could spend her energy on Julian. David was the ground floor. Julian was the view from the penthouse. That evening, David came home earlier than usual. He found Elena on the balcony, wrapped in a cashmere throw, staring out at the city skyline. She was smiling at her phone, her thumbs moving rapidly. The expression on her face was soft, unguarded, a look of dreamy anticipation that David hadn't seen directed at him in years. As the sliding door clicked shut behind him, Elena jumped. She instinctively locked the screen and placed the phone face down on her lap. The smile vanished, replaced by a mask of neutral politeness. "You're home early," she said. It sounded like an accusation. "I finished up the specs for the river project," David lied. He walked to the railing, standing near her but not touching her. "Who were you talking to?" "Just work," she said, picking at a loose thread on the blanket. "Julian is spiraling about the font choice for the invites. I have to talk him off the ledge. It's exhausting." "You looked happy," David observed, his voice devoid of judgment. "I was laughing at his incompetence," she countered quickly. "He's a child, really." David looked at her. He saw the slight flush on her neck, the dilated pupils. She was high on the drama, addicted to the chaos Julian provided. She didn't want peace. She wanted the thrill of the creative process, and Julian was her drug of choice. "I see," David said. He turned and walked back inside. He didn't ask what was for dinner. He didn't ask about her day. He went into his study and closed the door. He sat at his desk and opened his personal banking portal. He looked at the joint credit cards, the supplementary allowance he transferred to her personal account each month to support her lifestyle maintenance. The wardrobe, the salon visits, the dinners that kept her looking like the perfect PR executive. If she wanted to be an artist's muse, she would have to learn that artists were notoriously poor providers. David closed his laptop. The analysis was complete. The structure was unsound. It was time to pull the supports. The first thing Elena noticed was the coffee. For 6 years, the smell of freshly ground Arabica had been her alarm clock. David was an early riser, a creature of precise habits, and by the time Elena drifted into the kitchen at 7:30 a.m., there was always a ceramic mug waiting for her on the granite island. It was always at the perfect temperature, with a splash of oat milk, exactly how she liked it. It was a silent "I love you" that she drank every morning without thinking. On Tuesday morning, the kitchen was cold. The air smelled of nothing but sterilized marble and dust. Elena walked into the room, tightening the belt of her silk robe, her eyes scanning the empty counter. The coffee machine was dark. The mug was in the cupboard. David was already dressed, standing by the foyer mirror, adjusting his cufflinks. He looked impeccable in a navy suit, his face calm and unreadable. "You didn't make coffee?" Elena asked, her voice thick with sleep and mild irritation. David didn't turn around. He checked his watch. "I was running late. I grabbed some at Starbucks." "You could have made a pot before you left," she muttered, opening the cabinet and reaching for the beans. "It takes 2 minutes." "I didn't have 2 minutes," he said simply. He picked up his briefcase. "Have a good day." The door clicked shut before she could retort. Elena stood there, the bag of coffee beans in her hand, feeling a strange, dislocated annoyance. It wasn't just the coffee. It was the disruption of the ecosystem. The service had stopped. The withdrawal didn't end with caffeine. It seeped into the architecture of their evenings. Usually, when Elena came home, she would unload the day's burdens onto David. She would pour a glass of wine and pace the living room, dissecting every slight, every email, every crisis at the PR firm. David would listen, offer solutions, validate her feelings, and talk her down from the ledge. He was her emotional anchor. That night, she came home buzzing with frustration. Julian had changed the concept for the charity gala again, demanding a structural overhaul that was impossible with the budget. "He's insane," Elena vented, throwing her purse onto the sofa. "He wants a floating stage, David. A floating stage over the pool. I told him it's a liability nightmare, but he just said, 'Art doesn't care about insurance.' Can you believe that?" She waited for David to chuckle, to shake his head, to explain the engineering impossibility of it, to side with her against the chaos. David was sitting in his armchair, reading a journal on urban planning. He didn't look up. "Sounds challenging," he said. His tone was polite, distant, like a stranger echoing conversation in an elevator. Elena paused, her wineglass halfway to her mouth. "That's it? Sounds challenging?" "He's the creative director, Elena," David said, turning a page. "I'm sure the two of you can vibrate on the same frequency to solve it." The reference to her soulmate comment was subtle, delivered without a hint of sarcasm, which made it sting worse. It was a mirror held up to her own words. "You're being passive-aggressive," she accused. "I'm being professional," David replied, finally looking at her. His eyes were cool, void of the warmth she was used to manipulating. "I'm an architect, remember? Too rigid. I wouldn't want to bore you with technicalities." He stood up, closing the journal. "I'm going to bed. I have an early site visit." He left her standing in the living room, full of nervous energy with nowhere to put it. The silence of the apartment felt heavy, pressing against her eardrums. She wanted to fight, but he wouldn't engage. He had simply resigned from his position as her therapist. 2 days later, the The logistical safety net vanished. Elena's credit card was declined at a business lunch with a potential client. It was humiliating. She had to use her corporate card, which she knew would trigger an audit query later. When she stormed home to confront David, checking her banking app, she saw the notification. Automatic transfer canceled. "You cut off the allowance," she said, storming into the study where David was working. "I adjusted the budget," David corrected, not looking away from his screen. "We have the anniversary dinner coming up. I'm reallocating funds to ensure the evening is memorable." "I rely on that transfer for my personal expenses, David. You can't just stop it." "You have a salary, Elena. A very good one." "That's not the point. We are married. Your money is my money." David stopped typing. He swiveled his chair to face her. The movement was slow, deliberate. "Partnership is about shared investment," he said quietly. "Lately, I've realized the return on investment has been poor. You have your soulmate for the emotional connection. I assumed you'd want to be independent in other areas too." "You are punishing me," she whispered, her eyes welling up with tears, a tactic that had worked 100 times before. David watched the tears form. He felt a phantom ache in his chest, the old instinct to comfort her rising up, but he crushed it under the weight of the logic he had built. "I'm not punishing you, Elena," he said, turning back to his work. "I'm just giving you the space you asked for." Elena stood there for a moment, waiting for him to cave. When the typing resumed, steady and rhythmic, she turned and fled the room. David didn't follow her. He didn't check on her when he heard the bedroom door slam. He simply continued to work, dismantling their life one canceled transfer, one unmade cup of coffee, one silence at a time. He was no longer the husband. He was the ghost in the machine, and the machine was beginning to malfunction. The venue for the impending charity gala was a cavernous, refurbished warehouse in the West Loop, a space of exposed brick, steel beams, and echoing potential. It was the kind of raw environment David usually loved, a puzzle of load-bearing capacities and spatial flow. But today, standing amidst the construction dust and the frantic energy of the setup crew, he felt like a spectator at a demolition derby. The crisis, as predicted, centered on the water feature. Julian stood in the center of the room, his cashmere scarf looped theatrically around his neck, gesturing wildly at the empty concrete floor. Beside him, the city fire marshal, a man built like a vending machine and possessing zero patience for metaphors, was shaking his head slowly. "I don't care about the fluidity of the narrative," the marshal barked, tapping his clipboard. "You want to suspend 3 tons of water and glass over a gathered crowd in a building from 1920? Without a reinforced truss system. It's a code violation. I'm shutting it down." Elena stood between them, her face pale. She was holding a tablet like a shield, her knuckles white. She turned to David, her eyes wide with a desperate plea. This was the moment in the script where David was supposed to step in. In the past, David would have walked over, shaken the marshal's hand, knowing him from previous zoning hearings, and negotiated a compromise. He would have sketched a quick structural reinforcement on a napkin, called a favor from a contractor, and solved the problem in 20 minutes. He would have been the hero, allowing Julian to take the credit for the vision while David did the math. David met Elena's gaze. He saw the panic. He saw the expectation. He smiled, a polite, vacant expression, and stayed exactly where he was. "David?" Elena called out, her voice tight. Can you talk to Officer Miller?" Explain the structural integrity? David adjusted his cuffs. I wouldn't want to overstep, Elena. This is Julian's vision. I'm sure he has a plan for the physics. Elena blinked, stunned. But the permit? Julian is the creative director, David said, his voice smooth and loud enough for the group to hear. He turned to Julian. You said art doesn't care about insurance, right, Julian? I imagine you've calculated the trust load factors. Julian faltered. The charismatic arrogance that worked in dimly lit bars and client meetings evaporated under the harsh fluorescent work lights. I assumed the building could handle it. It's an artistic installation, not a permanent structure. Gravity applies to temporary structures too, the marshal grunted. You have 2 hours to show me a certified structural engineer's stamp on these plans, or the stage is condemned. 2 hours? Julian squeaked. He looked at David. David, man, come on, you have a stamp, just sign off on it. The audacity of it was breathtaking. Julian was asking David to put his professional license, his livelihood, on the line for a project he had been excluded from, all to save the reputation of the man sleeping with his wife. David looked at the ceiling beams, feigning deep consideration. I can't sign off on something I didn't design, Julian. That would be unethical. Besides, David looked at Elena, his eyes cold and hard. You two have such a profound connection. I'm sure you can solve this together. You don't need a third wheel cluttering up the dynamic. David, please, Elena hissed, stepping closer to him, lowering her voice. This is my career. If the gala is a disaster, I lose the account. Help me. I am helping you, David whispered back. I'm letting you see what he's actually capable of. He checked his watch. I have a meeting across town. Good luck with the marshal. David turned and walked away. The sound of the argument erupted behind him before he even reached the exit. He heard Elena's voice, sharp and shrill, for the first time directed at Julian. How could you not check the weight limits? You said you handled it. I'm an artist, Elena, not a contractor. Stop yelling at me. David pushed open the heavy steel doors and stepped out into the crisp Chicago afternoon. The air tasted clean. He didn't go to a meeting. He walked to a coffee shop across the street, ordered a black coffee, and sat by the window. From his vantage point, he could see the entrance of the warehouse. 20 minutes later, he saw Julian burst out the side door, frantically making a call, looking small and defeated against the backdrop of the massive brick building. Moments later, Elena appeared. She wasn't looking at Julian with adoration anymore. She was looking at him with the terrified realization that the man she had called her soulmate couldn't even hang a picture frame without burning the house down. David took a sip of his coffee. The bitterness was gone. It tasted sweet. The private dining room at the Spire was a glass jewel box suspended 40 stories above the Chicago Loop. It was one of David's earliest and most celebrated designs, a testament to transparency and structural daring. Tonight, however, the transparency felt like a threat. 30 guests sat around the long, rectangular table adorned with white orchids and silver candelabras. The mood was a fragile veneer of celebration. Elena sat at the head of the table, looking breathtaking in emerald velvet, though her smile was tight, her eyes darting nervously toward David, then to Julian, who was seated awkwardly 3 chairs down on her left. David had insisted on inviting Julian. He's part of your life, Elena, David had said, his voice terrifyingly reasonable. It would be rude to exclude your soulmate from a celebration of love. Elena had been too afraid to argue, fearing it would trigger the explosion she had been waiting for all week. The warehouse disaster had been salvaged, barely, by a very expensive emergency contractor David had recommended, but refused to call himself. The gala was safe, but the dynamic had shifted. Elena looked tired beneath her makeup. The dinner service was impeccable. Wine flowed. Laughter bubbled up, fueled by expensive Cabernet and the relief that the perfect couple was still intact. As the dessert course, a deconstructed dark chocolate tart, was cleared, the room quieted. It was time for the toast. David stood up. He held his champagne flute by the stem, the crystal catching the light of the city below. The room fell into a respectful hush. Elena reached for her water glass, her hand trembling slightly. 10 years, David began, his voice warm, projecting easily across the room. 10 years is a long time to build a life. In architecture, we talk about stress tests. We talk about the loads a structure can bear before it fractures. He smiled down at Elena. She forced a smile back, her eyes pleading with him to keep it standard, to keep it safe. For a long time, I thought marriage was about two people holding up the roof together, David continued. But recently, Elena taught me something profound. She taught me that sometimes the structure we build isn't enough. Sometimes destiny has other plans. A few guests exchanged confused glances. Julian shifted in his seat, adjusting his collar. "A few weeks ago," David said, his gaze drifting to Julian, "Elena shared a truth with me. She told me that she had found her soulmate, someone she vibrates with on a frequency I can't quite match." The room went dead silent. The air conditioning hummed. Elena froze, her face draining of color. "David," she whispered, a soundless plea. David ignored her. He looked at the guests with a beatific, almost saintly expression. "At first, I was hurt. I admit it. But then I realized, who am I to stand in the way of a cosmic connection? Who am I to be the obstacle to my wife's true happiness?" He raised his glass higher, turning fully toward Julian. "So, tonight, I don't want to toast to the past 10 years. I want to toast to the future, to Elena and Julian." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Someone dropped a fork. The clatter was deafening. Julian looked like he wanted to dissolve into the floor. He opened his mouth to speak, to laugh it off, but David cut him off. "I'm serious," David said, his voice dropping an octave, heavy with gravitas. "I am stepping aside. I've spoken to my lawyers. The penthouse is yours, Elena, for now. I've moved my things to the club. I want you to be free to explore this destiny without the burden of a husband who is too rigid, too boring, too black and white for you." He looked at Elena, whose eyes were wide with horror. She wasn't looking at a man who was angry. She was looking at a man who had opened the cage door and challenged the bird to fly, knowing it had forgotten how. "You said it wasn't a joke, Elena," David said softly, misquoting her on purpose, twisting the knife. "So I'm taking you seriously. I'm giving you exactly what you wanted." He tipped his glass toward her, drained it in one swallow, and set it gently on the table. "Happy anniversary, darling." David didn't wait for a response. He walked away from the head of the table, moving past the stunned guests, past a petrified Julian, and out of the glass room. Behind him, he heard the first sob break from Elena's throat, a raw, ugly sound of panic. The silence of the room shattered into murmurs and whispers. The punchline had been delivered, and as David walked toward the elevator, buttoning his coat, he realized he had never felt lighter. The building hadn't collapsed on him. He had simply walked out the front door and let the roof fall on them. The elevator ride down from the 40th floor of the spire was the longest 45 seconds of Elena's life. David had left them with the bill, a final, silent stroke of tactical genius. But the financial cost was irrelevant compared to the social currency that had just been incinerated. The guests had dispersed quickly, muttering vague apologies and avoiding eye contact, fleeing the radioactive site of the marriage's implosion. Now it was just Elena and Julian in the mirrored box of the elevator, watching the floor numbers tick down in descending order. Elena leaned against the back wall, her arms wrapped around herself, the emerald velvet of her dress feeling less like armor and more like a costume she had worn too long. She looked at Julian. He was checking his reflection in the polished brass doors, adjusting his scarf, running a hand through his hair. He wasn't looking at her. He was checking to see if the shame showed on his face. "He's insane," Julian muttered, finally breaking the hum of the machinery. "A complete psychopath. Who does that? Who makes a speech like that?" Elena closed her eyes. "He gave us what we said we wanted, Julian. He listened." "He humiliated us," Julian snapped, turning to her. His eyes were wide, darting with a frantic energy that wasn't artistic anymore. It was cowardly. "He made it sound like I broke up a home, like I'm the villain." "You called it destiny," Elena reminded him, her voice hollow. "You toasted to it." The elevator doors slid open with a cheerful chime. The lobby was expansive and cold, the night staff watching them with professional indifference. They walked out into the biting wind of the Chicago night. The valet stand was busy, cars pulling up for the fleeing guests. "Where are we going?" Elena asked. The question hung in the air, heavy and practical. David had said the penthouse was hers, but the thought of returning to that empty, glass-walled apartment alone, or worse, bringing Julian there to fill the void David had left, made her stomach turn. It would feel like trespassing in a mausoleum. Julian checked his phone, tapping the screen aggressively. I think I should go home. To my place." Elena blinked. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face. "Your place? David just left me, Julian. He just ended our marriage in front of everyone we know. I can't be alone right now." Julian winced. He took a half step back, creating a physical distance between them on the sidewalk. "Look, Elena, this is a lot. I'm an empath. You know that. I absorb energy. And right now, the energy is toxic. It's too heavy. I need to decompress." "You need to decompress?" Elena repeated, the absurdity of the words landing like a slap. "I just lost my husband. I just lost my life." "You didn't lose him. You threw him away." Julian's voice pitched up, cracking slightly. "And now you want me to pick up the pieces?" "I didn't sign up for a divorce scandal, Elena. I signed up for a connection, a vibe. This?" He gestured vaguely at her, at the street, at the reality of the situation. "This is messy. It's suburban. It's not us." "Not us?" Elena stepped closer, her anger finally igniting, burning through the shock. "You told me we were soulmates. You told me David was stifling me. You told me I deserved a love that was unbound." "Yeah, metaphorically," Julian shouted back, not caring who heard. "I'm an artist, Elena. I live in the moment. I can't be your replacement husband. I live in a studio loft. I sleep on a mattress on the floor. I can't handle your level of maintenance." He saw the valet pull up with his vintage Saab. Relief washed over his face, so naked and pathetic that Elena felt a wave of nausea. "I think we should take a break," Julian said, rushing toward the car door. "Just until the dust settles. Let David cool off. It's just a bad night." "It's not a bad night, Julian," Elena said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It's the rest of my life." Julian didn't hear her. Or if he did, he chose not to acknowledge it. He got into the car, the engine sputtering to life with a smoky cough. He didn't look back at her as he pulled away, merging into the traffic, a red taillight disappearing into the stream of the city. Elena stood alone on the curb. The cold seeped through the velvet, chilling her to the bone. She realized then the brilliance of David's cruelty. He hadn't fought for her because he knew he didn't have to. He knew that Julian was a mirage, a trick of the light that only existed when the sun was shining. The moment the storm hit, the mirage vanished. David had simply removed the shelter, and nature had done the rest. She reached into her clutch for her phone to call a car, her fingers numb. There were no missed calls from David, no texts asking if she was okay, no anger, just a terrifying, absolute silence. She looked up at the skyscraper above her, the building her husband had designed. It stood tall, rigid, and unyielding against the wind. It was strong because it had a foundation. She had taken a sledgehammer to hers, assuming she could fly. Now, looking at the empty street where her soulmate had just abandoned her, she realized she was falling, and there was no one left to catch her. The apartment was smaller than the penthouse, but it had better bones. Located in a converted printing press in the West Loop, it featured exposed timber beams and wide plank floors that creaked with a comforting honesty. There was no marble here, no velvet, just structure and light. David stood by the kitchen island, brewing a single cup of coffee. The silence in the room wasn't the heavy, suffocating vacuum of the last few months. It was a clean, white space, peaceful. The intercom buzzed at 7:15 p.m. He knew who it was. He had agreed to this meeting only because the lawyers required a signature on the asset separation documents, and Elena had insisted on bringing them personally. When he opened the door, the woman standing in the hallway looked like a faded copy of his wife. Elena was wearing jeans and a sweater, clothes she usually reserved for laundry days, and her hair was pulled back in a severe, messy bun. She looked smaller. Her posture collapsed inward. "David," she breathed, her voice cracking. She didn't step inside immediately. She waited for an invitation that didn't come. "Elena," he said, stepping back to let her enter, but keeping his hand on the door handle. "You brought the papers?" She walked in, clutching a manila envelope, but she ignored his question. Her eyes darted around the apartment, taking in the sparse furniture, the lack of clutter, the single coffee cup on the counter. "It's nice," she said, her voice trembling. "A bit industrial for you, isn't it?" "It's solid," David replied. "I like knowing what holds the roof up." Elena turned to him, tears already welling in her eyes. It was a performance he had seen 1,000 times, but for the first time he felt like he was watching a movie with the sound off. The emotional frequency she was broadcasting no longer reached him. "David, please," she started, dropping the envelope on a side table. "We don't have to do this. The lawyers, the separation. It's extreme. I made a mistake. A horrible, stupid mistake." "A mistake is forgetting to file a tax return, Elena," David said, leaning against the kitchen counter, crossing his arms. Calling another man your soulmate in front of our friends is a statement of intent. It was Julian, she cried, taking a step toward him. He manipulated me. He made me feel seen. But the moment things got real, he ran. He's a child. You were right about him. You were right about everything. She reached out, trying to grab his hand. David didn't flinch, but he didn't reciprocate. He let her hold his hand for a second, feeling her cold, desperate grip, before gently pulling away. I know I was right, David said softly. But that doesn't matter anymore. Of course it matters. I see it now. You're my husband. You're the one who was always there. I was just bored. I was looking for a spark, but it was just a joke, David. A stupid, cruel joke that got out of hand. Can't you forgive a joke? David looked at her, really looked at her, for the last time. He saw the panic behind her eyes. It wasn't love. It was the terror of a woman who had burned down her house and was now realizing it was going to rain. She didn't miss him. She missed the shelter. You know, I spent weeks thinking about that night at the gallery, David said, his voice conversational, devoid of anger. I kept asking myself why it hurt so much. And then I realized, you were right. Elena blinked, hope flickering in her eyes. I was? Yes. It was a joke. David smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. It was a smile of finality. Our marriage, the last 10 years, the idea that I could build a life stable enough to make you happy, that was the joke. I was the straight man, setting up the punchline for you and Julian. No, David, don't say that. But here's the thing about punchlines, Elena, he continued, walking to the door and opening it wide. Once they're delivered, the show is over. You don't repeat the joke. It's not funny the second time. He gestured to the hallway. I'm not angry anymore. I'm not jealous. I'm just done. I've left the theater. Elena stared at the open door, then back at him. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. There was no negotiation here, no structural flaw to patch. The building was gone. David, she whispered, her voice breaking into a sob. What am I supposed to do? You're free, David said. You wanted a life of passion and destiny, unburdened by my rigidity. Go find it. Elena stood there for a long moment, waiting for him to crack, waiting for the savior complex to kick in. But David just stood there, patient and still. Defeated, she turned and walked out into the hallway, the heavy timber floor absorbing the sound of her exit. David watched her walk to the elevator. He didn't wait for her to get in. He gently closed the door, the deadbolt sliding home with a satisfying, heavy thud. He walked back to the kitchen, picked up his coffee, and took a sip. It was still warm. He looked out the window at the Chicago skyline, a grid of lights and steel, beautiful and orderly. He was alone, and for the first time in 10 years, the silence wasn't empty. It was full of room.